Hello there, and welcome to another video and another interview, another video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce, a tippling philosopher. And today I am going to be speaking to Eddie Tabash, and I am really excited about this conversation because Mr. Tabash is someone whom I have known about for many years and have seen. In fact, when I first got into counter apologetics and atheism as a thing, William Lane Craig, it was all about William Lane Craig. And William Lane Craig was the debater of all debaters, and he was the fighter for Christianity, the white knight. And I remember seeing, or actually listening to one debate. There are only several debates where William Lane Craig, I think, has been bested, and one of them was with Eddie Tabash, who had just a lawyer, I think, a lawyer's approach to the debate, and it was just really great to hear, and I was really excited by that debate. And so, anyway, forward wind, I don't know, 15 years or something, and I have managed to secure speaking to Mr. Tabash now in this interview, and I'm really, really excited. So, without further ado, I would love my guests to introduce themselves and tell them a little bit about where they are now before we then go back in time a little bit. So, welcome.
Hi, I'm Eddie Tabash. I'm a constitutional lawyer in coastal Los Angeles, Pacific Palisades. And though I'm not a formally trained academic philosopher or scientist, in addition to legal work to secure secular government, I am and have been deeply involved in defending the atheist point of view against religious spokespeople in formal debates. And my journey toward atheism started with my parents. My father was an Orthodox rabbi from Lithuania. My mother was an Auschwitz survivor from Hungary. And my earliest memory was my deeply troubled mother when she brought me into the kitchen when I was 3 years old with a very wild look on her face and pointed to the oven. And you said, "You see where I bake things? Well, this is where my daddy, your grandfather, was burnt by the Nazis after they gassed him." And then there were a couple turning points when I was very young. When I was 6 years old at the Orthodox Hebrew school, the phrase even sends chills up my spine to this day. We little boys have to say a prayer. Dear God, thank you for not making me a woman. I went up to the rabbi and I said, it's only fair if the girls say the same thing. So the rabbi calls my dad in and says, are you letting Eddie play with Reformed Jews?
So that's interesting. I mean, we're going to talk a little bit about your mother in a second, because I think you sent me a fascinating article that you wrote for the Free Inquiry that details your experiences with your mother and growing up. But I sometimes wonder, or very often wonder, what makes us who we are, and when as early children or young children, you can see there are signposts about maybe what sort of person you'll end up being.
Yes, that was my doubts. And then a watershed moment was when I was 7 and we had the Passover Seder. And my dad, who always had doubts, he had stopped being a rabbi and opened a carpet store. We had a lot of people over and said, you see, my son, look what God did to get us away from Pharaoh. And I said, yes, but just a few years ago, we had somebody worse than Pharaoh, and God waited till 6 million of us were killed. And my dad looked at me and said, God is a very old man, and he sometimes takes naps at the wrong time.
That is absolutely brilliant. What a euphemism. That's a wonderful reflection of probably where your dad was at.
That was, and my dad wasn't good with English, but another time when I was 4 years old, and see, when the Hungarian Jews had a double shock. They thought they were exempt. And then here they are on the cattle car train to Auschwitz. My mother was in Miskolc, a large city in Hungary, and when the Nazi soldiers broke in before the Gestapo and SS transported them to Auschwitz, they killed my mother's youngest brother and then took her, her father, and another adult brother to Auschwitz. My mother had a flashback that I was the younger brother when I was 4 years old, came into my room screaming in Hungarian and German, and pushed me under the bed. And my dad came home and asked me what happened during the day. And I said, we played a fun game called The German Soldiers Are Coming. And he became ashen in complexion. And he said, my son, that wasn't a game. I said, yes, it was. There weren't German soldiers. And then he said something that was perfect. I told him right before he died at the age of 89 that he had never risen to the occasion like that. He sat me down and said, my son, you know, when you sleep, you dream. I said, yes. Mommy sometimes dreams when she's awake.
Yeah, and I remember reading
Yeah,
that in your
yeah, that
article,
was
and I thought
a,
that was such a perfect way
but
to explain.
the other thing was I always doubted the supernatural.
Yeah.
And I always had what was to me a fear that we were all physical and there's nothing transcendental and that death is the end. And so I remember the joke is at the age of 13, I became the Jesus questioning the rabbis. And I asked the head rabbi at the synagogue that I saw no reason to believe in a God unless there was life after death. Why pray to a God who kills us? What's the point? And I don't see how we can exist after we die when everything is destroyed, the brain. And uh, Rabbi Simon Dolgan, major Orthodox rabbi in the Los Angeles area, gave me one of the most inane answers that a child has ever heard from an adult. He said, our consciousness may not survive death, but we survive. And the 13-year-old me said, but what good is that if we're not aware of it?
And this is, I mean, that sums up the whole problem. I mean, I have written copiously, but I'm wondering whether I'm going to write a very short book on the soul, because for me, one of the huge problems with, you know, theistic viewpoints is the cornerstone of theistic beliefs is the afterlife, generally speaking.
Yeah.
Right. And for the afterlife to work, you need a transcendent vehicle with which to get yourself from here to there. But that must be connected to here in a way that if it's punished for eternity or rewarded for eternity, it is somehow connected to you in such a way that it is worthy of being punished and worthy of being blamed. Right.
Yes.
So,
Well, and the other thing I need to send you, it's not online, but in November of '03, I had a Does God Exist debate against Richard Swinburne. And I got him to more or less agree that hell was not eternal. And now, of course, his theodicy, I believe, falls apart. The greatest tragedies, he just explains away by saying, well, God needed to teach us something. And it was interesting because the right-wing Christian, University of Montana, the right-wing Christian groups brought him in. And they simplistically thought that because he's a leading Christian philosopher, he would be a right-winger on everything and would correspond to American religious
no,
conservatives.
with wholly
Anyway,
different kettle of
so
fish.
what happened was I challenged him with the idea of how can you justify what just happened a few weeks before here in Los Angeles. There was a gang shootout on a street in a poor area, and a bullet pierced the wall of a home and killed a little girl while she was sleeping. And I asked him for the justification for that. And his response was, God needed to send us a message because we Americans are awash in guns. So you can imagine Christian conservatives in Montana hearing supposedly their champion condemning rampant presence of guns. And they, in fact, one of his Christian student sponsors afterwards came up to him and said, Professor Swinburne, what exactly are you?
I mean, of course, the idea
Yeah,
that
right, right.
it would require an eternity to teach a lesson when you
Yeah,
mentioned before,
exactly.
you know, it's
And
like you're
and
a very bad teacher.
right, you're right, exactly. And then when I got into my late teens, I decided that if there is a transcendental reality, I would find it through direct experience. And I got into New Age meditation and spiritual seeking. And um, my poor father, I was um, doing all these strange exercises, trying to kindle what they called the Kundalini energy to rise through my spinal column and bring me enlightenment by exploding energy in my brain, the classic yogic. Um, so my poor Lithuanian rabbi father, I overhear him talking to a friend and says, now my son wants to find God with linguini. I mean, it was a little, and what happened was I found some good moments in meditation. And I certainly was zapped on the head by every single guru who came through Los Angeles. But I began to realize that even the lofty experiences in meditation were because of a physical brain.
Yeah.
So after 25 years, I I began to give up hope of life after death because of the dependence of consciousness on a physical brain. But my bridge from spirituality to atheism was an interesting guru, a man named Vedatiri from Madras in the Tamil Nadu, South India. He believed in all of the metaphysical craziness. He believed in all the psychic powers. But here's how he was my bridge. He did not believe in conscious life after death. What he said was, if life force energy doesn't interact with brain cells, we can't be conscious. So there's no way of self awareness after death. See what I mean by a bridge?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And um, I helped sponsor him for a number of years. And on his last trip to the US, I spent a lot of time with him. And I said, God is not, he kept talking about God and God's energy. I said, but God is not self aware. And he said, how could God be self aware without a brain? And this is from a guru that kept talking about God and the absolute.
Yeah.
So that was my bridge. Um, and what happened, though, is I did the opposite. Most people come to scientific skepticism um, and disbelieve in the paranormal and then give up God. I gave up God first, but still believed in
Right.
various uh, and then what brought me
Because
kicking, yeah,
some of those other beliefs, those other kind of paranormal beliefs,
yeah,
because I remember going back to when I was young and being interested in the X-Files and the
yeah,
unexplained, and I think I'd given up God, but there were these cool ideas that were fun and sort
yeah,
of
yeah,
like,
yeah,
do you know what I mean?
exactly, yeah, and that's exactly what happened. um, but for instance, I still will meditate, but what it is it's sitting, trying to quiet my mind, and quite frankly, working through problems.
Mm.
Now, uh, it's interesting because one of the world's best known atheists, Sam Harris, wrote a book, Waking Up, about meditation. And I had to criticize it in a book review because to me, he too easily accepted the claims of Eastern Path spirituality. For instance, in the book, he said that the early 20th century Indian guru Ramana Maharshi became a spiritual adept at the age of 16. What does an atheist mean by believing that?
I think that sort of sums up how some people can be skeptical in a lot of areas, but then there
Yeah.
are these odd pockets where they don't apply.
I think this week I sent you that article. I'm not sure. If
Yeah,
not, I'll
I haven't,
resend. Yeah,
yeah, I
yeah,
haven't read that yet.
uh, he also said that it's an illusion to think we're a separate self. But
Yeah,
as I pointed out, there's no way that we are not a separate self. So, for instance, if there is a joint appearance on stage with Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, we know who is who. But if there's no such thing as a separate self, and if our self awareness is contained in a physical vessel, how can we not be separate? And so see what uh, so once I made by 1995 my atheism, I mean, even in by 1993, though I still practice New Age spirituality, I debated noted Christian philosopher Peter Van Inwagen on God's
right.
existence. So I gave up on God before I gave up on the paranormal. But my ultimate, after decades of journey and spiritual search, came to be what I later found through atheist philosopher Paul Draper,
Right.
uh,
Good.
that there's nothing beyond the physical, and nothing mental happens without something physical happening. But again, sort of the flagship concern that made me seek and that made me give up the quest was the issue of life after death.
Yeah, I mean, I think really, God, there's so much I could talk about with the afterlife. I'm kind of obsessed with it at the moment because it really is, as I said earlier, the cornerstone of theistic belief. But also, it doesn't make sense. The soul doesn't make sense. The after, how
Yes.
how you're represented in the afterlife, and yet it's still accountable. So what? And you start asking people, well, what is a soul? What does it do? And they start giving you like characteristics of the soul which are already described by other aspects of you as a physical and mental person. And so you're like, well, that's memory, or that's your rationality, or that's this, or that's that. It's like, no, but what's a soul? How's the soul different to the things? I mean, you're just telling me stuff that is already part of me, like, and that I can explain perfectly adequately. So therefore, what is a soul? How does it get me from here to there? And then you have all the problems of an eternal heaven or eternal hell. And you're like, you've got an eternity, which is an awfully long time. And if
Yeah.
that's not mentioned in the Old Testament in any
No.
discernible manner, then like your actual life is what we call an infinitesimal. So it's like a tiny fraction that approaches zero in terms of time. And yet eternity in an afterlife is massive. How can the Bible, the Old Testament particularly, concentrate so much on this very almost negligible existence and forget to tell you about eternity?
Well, again, the 13-year-old future atheist Jesus arguing with the rabbis in the temple, I pointed out to, again, these leading Orthodox rabbis that the very Tanakh, the Old Testament, tells us there is no life after death. I think there's one, I don't know if it's in Ecclesiastics, the dead know not anything. And King David slept with his fathers, not cavorting with them on clouds. They were asleep. And the dead know not anything.
Yeah.
So, and as I told them that after the destruction of the Second Temple and the rise of Rabbinic Judaism, uh, though the concept of the afterlife came about with rabbis starting after the 70 CE destruction of the temple by the Romans, it doesn't matter the thousands of years. The rabbis had no authority to reinterpret the clear meaning of the scripture.
I mean, it seems very clear that there is annihilationism throughout the Bible, which is not even
the Old Testament. Yeah.
Sorry, the Old Testament. You die. That's it.
Yeah.
And then Daniel starts talking about the general resurrection, so it starts getting a bit funky there. And then you then start basically the intertestamental period, and you get the Hellenic Jews oppressing the Orthodox Jews, for want of a better phrase.
Yes, yeah.
And then saying, hang on, we're the chosen ones. How come bad stuff is happening to good people? And you had to look to the Greeks to say, well, they can kind of understand this in terms of an afterlife. So we're going to nick that idea, and then we're going to apply that to ourselves. I know why bad things can happen to good people and why good things happen to bad people. It's because it's all going to be justified in an afterlife. So do you know what? It doesn't end when we die, and that's how we justify it.
And then the other thing which began to really vex me when I was very young was the attributes of God. All powerful, all good, all knowing.
That's basically my latest book, 30 Arguments Against the Existence of God, Heaven, Hell, Satan, and Divine Design, is exactly about that. And I'm obsessed with that.
Yeah, and also I have to tell you that if I could put something in a time capsule to be opened by humans 500 years from now, a lot of your books would be in there.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah, and I worry about. It's like I don't want to see what 500 years from now will look like.
Yeah.
But I remember one of the when I do my actual debates, I actually visit and physically sit with for hours atheist philosopher Theodore Drange.
Right.
And one of the things he pointed out is the conflict between omniscience and omnipotence. For instance, in the book of Exodus, it says, God repented of the evil he sought to do unto his people. How does that work? If you're omniscient, you know you ultimately won't do it. So how do you repent? I mean, how did God first not know, the biblical God, that he won't do it, and then he did know? And if you're omnipotent, you can do anything, even changing your mind. But how can you change your mind when you already know everything that's going to happen?
Absolutely spot on.
Yes.
So I think divine foreknowledge is the biggest problem for God, but divine foreknowledge of his own future actions means that he can only do that which he already knows he's going to do.
Right. So back in 1994, there were numerous efforts by Orthodox Jews to capture me back because I was quite a prize. The Hebrew word, I think, is the Bala Tshuva, the returned ones. And I see a lot of my contemporaries, professionals, former secular, who now have become pretty observant Orthodox Jews. And I was talking to a television producer, was involved in the drama Roots, and he told me he doesn't call himself Orthodox. He just says he's a Jew who takes God very seriously. And I said, that's my point. I'm also a Jew who takes God very seriously. That's why I can't believe in him.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's and then one of the things that I've always thought is the overwhelming evidence that there's nothing supernatural. That doesn't get enough play. The evidence that the world is physical and that there are no supernatural beings or realms is so overwhelming.
I think part of the problem is that, because I often think about it, I was going to ask you about being an atheist and an advocate for secular humanism and all the work you've done and all the debates you've done. And there's such a close relationship between atheism and humanism advocacy, and then debunking all sorts of other crazy claims, including generally the supernatural. So, you know, that's an interesting interesting bedfellows. And why is it that that's so often the case? But why do the ideas of the supernatural still maintain so easily? And I think it goes back to the fact that actually they're fun, and that you have fiction, films, movies, TV shows, and books like absolutely love the supernatural. Like, it allows you vehicles to tell really good, exciting, gripping tales of realities that just don't exist. And so, but because people, it's so in our culture, these ideas of the supernatural, whether it be ghosts or this or that, that I think that people like to think it's true, or don't want to let go of it, or because they hear about it all the time, they just think it's more credible than it really is.
Yes, and then the argument from evil seems to me to not ultimately be answerable. In 1999, and the Canadian philosopher J.L. Schellenberg took me from what, in terms of atheist philosophy, from what was still the basement in a fast elevator to the penthouse. And I told him this. His argument from divine hiddenness
I was
is
going to
so
ask you
comprehensive.
about that.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you about that in terms of your mother being an Auschwitz survivor.
Yes. Yeah. And it's not only that if a God exists, who knows that many of us need proof and doesn't give us that proof, but yet wants us to believe in him, that makes such a God more unlikely. It's also that if a God wants us, again, saying him because I'm saying the biblical God and the Quranic God, if such a God wants us to believe that this God exists, then equally we would get an explanation for evil. And the failure to explain away unjustified evil is more consistent with there not being a God that wants us to believe in him than one that there is. Because God knows our minds. How can I worship a being that's given me no proof of its existence and that has had the power to stop all the suffering? Now, another thing from atheist philosopher Paul Draper, which is a very profound comment, is God could not allow evil and suffering without a morally sufficient reason. We need to know what those reasons are.
Yep.
And then again, let's take omnipotence seriously. If God is truly omnipotent, God can only justify the horrendous evil and suffering if that was necessary to prevent greater evil and suffering. But that's a high hurdle for an omnipotent being. Also, if God is omnipotent, God has to be able to say, this greater good I could have only brought about by allowing the horrendous evil and suffering. That's a high bar for an omnipotent being.
You're absolutely right, and it's people who have watched me in my talks before. I mean, you're right on my territory of stuff I love talking about. Okay, but the idea. So I always use the tsunami killing 240,000 people, right? And what you're saying there is absolutely spot on, in my opinion. That God. Some or theists, Christians, have to explain how an omniscient God would allow, or not even allow, but design into reality a tsunami that kills 240,000 people and countless animals, right? Yeah. And so you have to say, well, it's necessary. It's necessary for a greater good to come about, because if that good could come about with one person less dying, then that would have happened, but it didn't happen. So exactly that amount of people dying and those amount of animals dying was necessary to bring about whatever greater good that is that it brings about. But we're not even told what that greater good is. So there's kind of divine hiddenness going on with a lack of explanation, a lack of clarity. And as you mentioned in many of your debates, Eddie, is you talk about the inference to the best explanation. You mentioned Draper
Yeah.
already, who talks about these abductive arguments, which is you're presenting all these arguments at the moment and saying, okay, it doesn't disprove God, but if we're going for the inference to the best explanation, what is this data best explained by? Is it the hypothesis of atheism, or is it the hypothesis of theism? Atheism.
Yes, and the see, most people, again, going back to life after death, if you gave the majority of religious people, let's say here in the United States, two choices, even the ones that wear their religion on their sleeves, you have two choices: live in a universe where there's a God, but death is the end of you, or live in a universe without God and you're immortal. They would take the one where they're immortal. So I think psychologically, people cling to God because they see that as the only hope of not being annihilated at death.
So I've done a video on what's called terror management theory before, which is mortality salience. This idea
Yeah,
that God is the vehicle that delivers mechanisms that allow you to cope with death and finality and the finitude of your life. And yeah, I think you're right. It's not God per se, but it's the package that comes with God, which is
exactly. Very well put. The package that comes with God.
yeah.
Now, the other thing too, again, going back to the supernatural, uh, and bringing in divine hiddenness. If God wanted us to believe in the existence of a supernatural being, why would God perform all those incredible miracles for pre-scientific ancients, but not for us today? Let Jesus come back, be re-crucified, and have the world's top scientists examine him, confirm he's dead, then have him come back to life, and then have every television camera in the world watch him floating up into the sky.
It seems very convenient that all the great miracles of the Bible happened in pre-video
Right.
recording times.
By the time I was 10 years old, I set a trap for one of the rabbis. It was my first lawyer trick. The rabbi came over and asked me what I did the previous day. And I said, I watched all these horror movies, Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman. And he said, now you know that isn't real. So I took the Bible and I pointed to the talking snake in Genesis. And I said, and this really happened?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you
You
must have
know,
been a fun kid for the rabbi. So,
oh yeah,
um,
yeah. And uh,
which
a-
leads on to the idea, the fact that you became a lawyer.
yeah,
Do you think that you became a lawyer as a result of being that sort of questioning person? Was it the right fit for you? I mean,
it
it
was the
was.
right fit for me intellectually, but in a competitive place like the Los Angeles area or anywhere in the United States, much of law practice is so much setting traps, um, and both sides bludgeoning each other, that the day-to-day practice of law doesn't allow for this idealism. My concern was always, uh, well, keeping government neutral in matters of religion. But the other thing that horrified me was censorship. And
And
I
so
remember,
is there a natural tension there? You're saying you want the government to be able to act in morally but neutrally,
yes,
but you also don't want them to be censoring people, so people should be able to say what they like.
exactly,
Yeah,
exactly. I remember uh, when 1964, again, I was 13, uh, and the famous uh, comedian Lenny Bruce in West Hollywood was using 7 prohibited curse words in a nightclub act. And I remember he was arrested and charged with obscenity. And I thought to myself, that should never be. and then the one who the deputy sheriff who arrested him decades later became Los Angeles County Sheriff. And I actually got him to tell me, of course, he had no choice and he was ordered to do it, but that ultimately a legal system that would arrest someone for what Bruce did was immoral. And he was happy that could no longer happen today. And he also said pragmatically, as the head of a law enforcement department, he didn't want to have to waste time going after people who weren't hurting anybody just by using curse words and foul language. Also, I don't know if you look at American-made movies and you look at a film made in 1965 and you look at films made from 1969 onward, you will see a dramatic increase in the level of topics and the boldness of things that would otherwise be censored. And that's because for about 40 years, the Catholic Church was able to censor just by pressure the content of film.
Wow.
Yeah, and otherwise liberal Hollywood was enthralled. I mean, I remember even television shows in the mid 50s where you couldn't even say the word pregnancy.
Really?
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, and the and also, for instance, where you are, I was very concerned, and luckily, it didn't happen when Tony Blair wanted a blasphemy law that would protect all religions from being offended. I mean, why, in a free society, do you carve out only religious beliefs so that its devotees are insulated?
Yeah. I
I mean,
think so. I remember Rowan Atkinson came up big time against that proposed idea, and it was the idea that you know, in any kind of liberal society, the ability to take the mickey out of people and things and ideas is an absolute cornerstone of liberty. And if you can't do that, you're in trouble. And if you're going to allow blasphemy to be enshrined in law, as say, for example, Pakistan, and then it can then be used for all sorts of nefarious reasons, then you know you're in trouble.
now look at what one of our viewers, Soren, just posted. At the age of 16, the Catholic priest told him to stop reading Jewish writers.
Yeah, I love that. I thought I'd put that up for you there, Mr. Tabash,
Yeah,
because
yeah, but look at that at the. So here is another thing that uh, uh, has always concerned me. If religion is so true and so powerful, let it fight it out with the rest of us in the free marketplace of ideas and not demand to enter the arena being able to fight freestyle with no limit, but the rest of us have to observe the Marquis of Queensberry rules.
yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah, I mean, why is it? Now, of course, in Islamic countries, we just had the horrendous event where Mubarak Bala, an atheist in Nigeria, was sentenced to 24 years in prison for blasphemy.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, this is
Bala. Well, what's
yeah,
it? Yeah.
yeah. This is a so not only do we need to promote the arguments for atheism, we have to persuade much of the world that it should even be legal and not a punishable act to do so.
Yeah.
A few years ago, Saudi Arabia beheaded a woman for practicing sorcery. And so basically, that country killed somebody for committing a crime that's impossible to commit.
That's a really good point.
Yeah,
That's overlooked.
They sent an undercover religious police officer to see her, and he said that he wants to get his former lover back, and she said she would do some incantation to do that, and then that led to the charge of sorcery and her beheading.
And I think, like, to speak to what you were saying just now, the idea that, and you see this often in Islamic fundamentalism, where humans will take on the offense to God, right, and execute you for offending God. It's like, well, do you know what? If God was really offended, I'm sure he can do stuff for himself. Like, you don't need to step in and arbitrate for God. He's powerful enough to and I'm sure he can fight his own battles. And let's argue this out, as you say, in the marketplace of ideas, rather than.
Now, that's why, for instance, when the First Amendment was drafted in 1789 by primarily James Madison, the aspect of the American Constitution from which we derive the separation of church and state, there shall be no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The greatest influence on Madison was Thomas Jefferson. And 2 years before, in his notes on Virginia, in speaking out against any and all prejudice against non-believers, Jefferson famously wrote, "It does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg."
It's brilliant.
And also, Madison wrote to Jefferson before crafting the First Amendment that Jefferson wrote that, Madison said that he would fear that the majority would narrow the rights of conscience. And if you look at the record of the debates in the House and Senate on what was to become the First Amendment, if you look at that, you see that the rights of conscience were uppermost. So if the goal was to preserve the rights of conscience, regardless of where that led, there has to be equality of believer and non-believer. And also for religious right-wing legal scholars who insist that the Constitution, the First Amendment, was only supposed to prohibit government from favoring one religion over others, but does allow any branch of government in the United States to favor all religions against non-belief. Or as now deceased Justice Scalia chillingly said, that government should be able to favor religion over irreligion. I wonder where that stops. That's a frightening comment. There is an answer. When the Senate was considering what was to be the First Amendment before it went back to the House and Senate Conference Committee, there were two proposed wordings in September of 1789 that would have just prevented government from favoring one sect over the other, and they were both rejected, never brought back. Now, okay, on the United States Supreme Court, we have two dangerous interpretations, 2 out of the 9 justices. They go further than the others who say government can favor belief over non-belief. They twist the First Amendment around to say its sole purpose was not to protect the individual rights of conscience of the non-believer. They say, and there's really no justification for this, the purpose was just to stop the national government from interfering in state religious establishments. So their twisted interpretation means that each state in the United States should be able to have its own official religion. Now that would be as convoluted as that is, that would be a deadly blow to personal liberty, and that means theocracy.
We spoke about this a little before we went live, but presidential elections in America appear to be a proxy for Supreme Court
Yes,
nominations.
that's what I've been saying for 42 years. Yeah, and
it strikes me as that's why you vote someone in. I'm voting for Trump or I'm voting for Biden not because of X, Y, and Z, but I want the Supreme Court to have this kind of judge, and that's Trump was, if nothing else, or the GOP, if nothing else, were entirely successful.
yes, they were.
In what they did to the Supreme Court, and
Well,
now
look at how in the early 2016, let alone a week before the election, the Republican control of the Senate, Senator Mitch McConnell, would not allow Obama's
that's
nominee
a
to
crime.
even get a hearing, and yet Trump was able to get his nominee, Justice Barrett, confirmed to the court a week before losing the election. So
Don't get me started on the rank hypocrisy involved.
Right. But you see, here is the problem: is we now have 6 out of 9 justices who more or less say government can favor belief over non-belief, and the other way that's done is by misusing the free exercise clause, which is not prohibit the free exercise thereof, to allow only the religious to avoid complying with laws that apply to the rest of us.
Yeah.
Now, the way that would work is, let's say, again, in a public school, which is a branch of government where the First Amendment applies, you have 2 students in biology class. One doesn't want to dissect animals because of a religious objection. The other doesn't because of a secular philosophical objection. To our view, if you allow only the religious objector the exemption, you are unconstitutionally favoring religion. The 6 justices on the court believe it's valid to allow only religious objectors to avoid compliance with otherwise applicable laws.
And of course, that can be applied in so many different contexts.
Yes, it can.
That's how dangerous that is.
Right. Now, again, the frightening case that we argued in the court this past Monday of the football coach in Washington State who would lead as part of his function as a public school teacher, would lead his players in Christian prayer after a game on the football field. And it seemed that some of the justices, even acknowledging that children might be unconstitutionally coerced by their teacher, seemed to say, but his right to pray supersedes that. You see, the problem is this: you are on a sports team in a public school. After the game, your coach, your teacher for that activity says, I invite all the players to pray with me. 15, 16-year-old who doesn't want to pray is going to pray.
Yeah. There's a kind of like, even if it's not overt coercion, it's social coercion, isn't it? It's expectations.
Now, again, a very interesting comment by Soren. It's that the divisions between American fundamentalist Protestants and right-wing Catholics have been totally buried in favor of a mutual commitment to bringing about theocracy.
Yeah, and for those who are only listening to this, who might just listen to their YouTube videos, Soren Alexander has just asked, it's just observed in a comment, it's so odd how American Protestants really, really don't like Catholics, yet the SCOTUS, so the Supreme Court of the United States, is primarily ultra-Catholic. So in that context, they're particularly happy that they're a Catholic.
Right, there is. I mean, there is. Exactly, yes. And now, another example of this is when the California Supreme Court considered its first same-sex marriage case, and I wrote a brief for the Center for Inquiry, I argued that confining marriage to heterosexuals violates the separation of church and state because it favors a religious belief over non-belief, and it also favors one religious view over others. So that was the, and what I did was I pointed out that all of the amicus friend of the court briefs urging the continued ban on same-sex marriage came from religious groups, particularly an organization that it's almost like I'm an animal in the wild with my natural enemy, the Knights of Columbus, a Catholic men's group that was one of the leading opponents of not just abortion rights, but contraception, same-sex marriage. I would almost say they are pre-Vatican II.
Yeah. Well, I see Doc asks here, so which is linked to what you're just saying there. Should atheists utilize the strategies of the gay community to gain leverage and make progress in the political sphere? So the idea is, like, my view is that in some respects, there's a blip in the general progress of humanity at the moment, and it seems like there are really undemocratic elements in the US taking place. The politically speaking, things are not looking good. The health of democracy in the States is not optimal, and in that, within all of that context, is the non-religious, who are this growing community of people in the States that you are representing, legally speaking, that I'm trying to represent as a columnist for Only Sky and in my writing. It's okay. So going forward, it's looking good for the non-religious, but in the death throes, possibly, or like a caged, like an animal that's been backed into a corner, the religious are fighting extra hard at the moment, and it looks like
they're winning at the moment.
They're winning at the moment,
yes, yeah.
Even though the long-term prognosis is good for the non-religious in terms of demographics and the youth.
Well, we're going to be by the religious right-wing Supreme Court and the power of the religious right in the country. The journey toward atheist equality is going to be set back by at least 25 years.
What do you think that is incontrovertibly going to happen? Do you think
it's already happening? It's already happening. One of the reasons also is, for instance, the Chief Justice, who has many religious right-wing rulings, is now balking at the swiftness with which the court is starting to overturn precedent on church-state separation. But his main concern is he doesn't want the court over which he presides to go down in history as being blatantly politically motivated. And so the other religious right-wing justices would take away our freedoms in 5 minutes. He'd want to take 5 to 10 years because he's afraid of how the court that he's only one vote, but as a Chief Justice, it'll be called the John Roberts Court. He's afraid of how his court will look in history.
Is there? I don't know enough about John Roberts, but is there, because he's the guy in the middle, right? And actually, I think, would it be true to say that he's in light of the fact that there are a load of right-wing Supreme Court justices that have now in place, that he's almost shifted into a centrist position?
It's not quite. Yes. What it is well, in one opinion, where he sided with the religious right a number of years ago, and the same thing came up before the court now. He actually said that though he voted the way the religious right wanted him to a few years ago, he's doing the opposite now because he doesn't want the court to switch precedents so swiftly just because its composition has changed. He's concerned about the stability of the law. I mean, John Roberts, if you read his dissent in the same-sex marriage case that our side won, it's pretty bad. It's pretty bad. But what I think is John Roberts has remained the conservative or even the religious right-wing leaning justice he's always been, but justices that have come after him are so far right that by comparison he looks more moderate. I don't think he's changed.
Oh, right.
But where
I
he
was just
is
wondering
changing,
whether,
yeah. What I think he's afraid of is the court losing respect by showing that its interpretation of the Constitution depends only on who sits on the court at any moment in time, which is the way it works out in practice, but he doesn't want it to be so blatant.
it
Now,
just, yeah, as you say, I mean, it looks depressing, doesn't it? You know, going forward, when you look at the midterms as well, and if the Democrats lose the Senate, and I don't want to get overtly political here, but if the Democrats lose the Senate, then
you can't get any judges confirmed.
No.
Now, in 1998, I was invited back to my alma mater, Loyola Law School of Los Angeles. Went to law school at a Jesuit law school, and to meet Justice Scalia. And I got to question him afterwards, and I said, Your Honor, do we atheists have equal rights? He said, not entirely, but you can't be coerced. And I asked him how that fleshes out. And I gave him a hypothetical, which judges usually do to us lawyers. And I said, Your Honor, let's say the state of Mississippi says you get $5 off your state income tax, but only if you affirm belief in a supreme being. And he said he would strike that down as unconstitutional. But in terms of government articulating belief in God or articulating favoritism, see, in 2005, he chillingly wrote, luckily for us, it was still a dissent, that the United States Constitution permits the disregard of those who believe in unconcerned deities, like deists, multiple deities, Buddhist, Hindus, just as it permits the disregard of the devout atheist. Well, how far would that go? I mean, to what extent could there really be Nuremberg-style laws limiting the freedoms of atheists? And then, very chillingly, 3 years ago, Justice Thomas, speaking at Pepperdine Law School, and I wrote about this a number of times, said he doesn't understand why we atheists even take oaths since we don't believe there's anybody that we're accountable to. Well, the opposite is true. Why do Christians even swear to tell the truth? Because once you're saved, you don't lose your salvation by lying in court. So they even have less incentive to tell the truth than we atheists do. He doesn't understand his own religion.
That's an interesting point that I'd never thought about before. Yeah.
But what scared me is here, one of the 9 justices on the Supreme Court doesn't believe atheists can be relied on to be honest because of an absence in the belief in a fantasy creature.
And what's interesting is that funnily enough and annoyingly, that statistic or that anecdote of that judge, it actually applies across society. So it turns out that atheists are the least trusted group of people, pretty much. Out of
right. That is
even for atheists. So oddly enough, like atheists rate other people who are atheists less reliable than non-atheists. So there's this culturally embedded idea that believing that being holding a belief in God correlates well with or causes greater credibility and honesty. And that's just
And yeah,
that's just me.
but again, the response to that is the saved Christian has no incentive to abide by any law. There's nothing in the New Testament that says once you accept Jesus, you can still lose your salvation if you commit perjury.
Yeah, it's the idea is you can just do wrong and then ask for forgiveness.
Right, right.
You know?
This is and particularly with Catholics,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
can lie in court and then forgive me, Father, for I have sinned.
Sex abusing Catholic priests as a
Right, right.
point.
And exactly.
Case in
And
point.
yeah, but this is it's important to understand that if you are saved by faith alone, you can be an absolute scoundrel.
Yeah, yeah. It's a really
Yeah.
dangerous idea, isn't it? And that permits any kind of nefarious
It
behavior.
yes, yes. So actually Justice Thomas should be worried about his fellow Christians, not about us.
So you're quite right. So you as a lawyer who's been working on these sorts of cases for decades now, what in the context of religious, non-religious, as separation of church and state, those kind of ideas that would interest the viewers particularly, what is your biggest worry at the moment, or a particular case that's actually in,
Okay,
what is
well,
what?
the one that's now pending before the court that we argued on Monday about the football coach,
Yeah.
because the prayer 1962, 1963, where the court struck down organized prayer in public schools, where it struck down official Bible reading in public schools.
Which is a
And
big
even
thing for 62, 63.
yeah,
It strikes me.
and yeah, well, the Earl Warren Court. And then also in 1992, when the centrist Justice Kennedy got a 5-4 decision saying you can't even have non-sectarian prayer at school graduation, public school graduation, after the students have already graduated because it's coercive. So how much more coercive is it to have your coach beckon you to pray after a game? So if we lose this case, it takes with it a host of precedent that we can't afford to lose.
So
And for
where do you think that goes then?
e-
So if that,
okay, well, you see, where it goes is for the first time, the court will say, we recognize there's a danger that children can be coerced to pray by the teacher, but we're allowing the teacher's religious freedom right to supersede that. What about the religious freedom right of the children not to feel coerced by their teacher or coach to pray?
so do you feel how confident do you feel in this case, which way
We
it goes?
believe we're going to lose. The question is how badly. Will the court issue a narrow decision saying, in this particular case, or will the court at least say that the teacher has to give a whole soliloquy about really not wanting anybody to feel coerced to do this? And sort
But
of
say
falling all over.
it's allowed, it's allowed in principle, but you would have to.
Right, right. But you see, I mean, this is the concern that, well, I'll give you another example. We lost in the Supreme Court a case where the arts and craft shop Hobby Lobby,
I was going to mention Hobby
yes,
Lobby earlier. Yeah.
which is only it's a secular business, but because its owners were religious, we lost 5-4. Again, before we lost, even before Trump's
Yeah.
nominees gave them the clear majority, where the court ruled that an individual owner, even a secular business, has a special right to not comply with the Contraceptive Provision Act of the National Affordable Care Act. So only a religious objector, regardless of the type of business, can refuse to cover for contraception in terms of insurance policy. But what the court said was that in order to do this, they have to alert the government or an insurance carrier so that they will provide the coverage. Now, a year before Kavanaugh went on the Supreme Court, when he was on the District of Columbia Court of Appeals, a group called Catholic Priests for Life sued, claiming that even providing the notice violated their religious freedom, because providing the notice, they are putting in place a mechanism whereby somebody else will provide the contraception, but they're still in the line of fire of being a catalyst for that. So they don't even want to provide the notice.
So, all this, adds ammunition to your claim that things are not looking good going forward.
Right. Yeah, things are not looking good. So there are two fronts in the United States for the atheist. The first front is we have to promote church-state separation and sell it as the equal protection of both believers and non-believers. The second is we must do more to promote atheism per se and get the powerful arguments out there to the public. And this is really,
that's your life, isn't it? So
yeah.
That's your life, which is debates and advocating publicly and campaigning through the CFI and other institutions.
Right. But it's the problem I see is no one is challenging the automatic assumption that religious belief is superior to non-belief. I'll give you an example. Of course, Trump was president at the time, wanted to appease the religious right. When the preacher Billy Graham died, he was the first non-public official whose body would lie in state in the United States Capitol. Now, think of it. All he did was to spend 70 years telling people they will be punished with unspeakable torture forever, regardless of how otherwise good they are, if they didn't believe in his religion. And for that, he gets to lie in state in the U.S. Capitol. I remember even as a kid watching his crusades, he would come out and say, "Goodness alone won't save you." What that means is that my mother, the Auschwitz survivor, is now in hell. And if Hitler had sincerely opted for Jesus a moment before dying, he'd be in heaven.
The whole notion of eternal torment in hell
right.
is
And
unbelievably offensive.
But for that, he lies in state.
I know.
And yet, when Christopher Hitchens died, the official United States government didn't pour accolades on him for having the courage to challenge such beliefs.
And it was funnier.
Yeah. See, this is, but my fear is this: even if we non-believers are proliferating, a legal system that allows the states to favor religion will set us back. And particularly religious indoctrination in the schools.
Yeah. I mean, the problem here is that whilst the demographics look good, right, for non-religion, if the people in power, it's all about like the power players and their control over legal institutions and legal rulings. You can have as many people as you like proportionally being non-religious. But if you aren't changing the things up here, or aren't protecting the things up here, then that's all irrelevant. Those statistics are irrelevant. So it's about the Supreme Court, and it's about the other. Because when Trump came in, he not only, or the GOP took that opportunity to just absolutely fill the lower courts, didn't they? With
Yes,
a
they did.
whole load
And now here's one. Luckily, even this Supreme Court gave us some temporary relief. The lower courts held that members of the United States Special Forces, actual Navy SEALs, had a freedom of religion right not to take the COVID vaccine, even though President Biden ordered it and he's the commander in chief, and even though by not taking it, they could infect their colleagues. So they were saying that in the United States military, you have religious freedom rights, even if it means putting everybody else in jeopardy. Okay, bad. Now, what the United States Supreme Court did was it said, until we further adjudicate this, they don't have to take the vaccine, but branches of the armed forces don't have to deploy them with others where they could infect them. But still, the and of course, Alito, Thomas, and Justice Gorsuch dissented on this one. They would take. In fact, what happened chillingly is the Supreme Court is like a giant clam. It can't get you unless you step in it. They have to get a case. So 2 years ago, Alito and Thomas, in dissent, in a same-sex marriage case, actually asked states in the United States to pass laws that go against same-sex marriage, so the case would come to the Supreme Court and they could overturn it.
Wow. And can they do that? Did they publicly do that? And then,
well, they did it in
is
an
that all
opinion.
right?
In an
Oh, right.
opinion. Yeah, it's now, for instance, in Justice. Oh, it was funny when I met Justice Scalia and I was peppering him with these questions, and he said to me, he said, "How can you disbelieve in supernatural beings after meeting me?" I said, "Your Honor, what do you mean?" He said, "You're going to have to go back to all your mates and tell them you met the devil in person." I mean, but he actually,
Did he delight in being this, like?
yes, he did. Yeah, he actually did, and it was. But that phrase of his, the Constitution permits the disregard of the devout atheist. What does that mean? Does it just mean that if the government wants to ceremonially acknowledge God and praise religion, that I can't get the government to stop? Or does it mean that if someone refuses, a bank refuses to make me a loan because I'm an atheist, they can get away with it? Could a state, like used to happen 200 years ago, bar me from appearing in court or testifying in court because I'm an atheist, like Justice Thomas suggested? Which means we atheists could be sued or charged with crimes and wouldn't be permitted to defend ourselves, which would be a real Nuremberg law. Where does it stop?
So, okay, so what is all looking quite depressing? What's a positive spin, or what's a good thing that you can see in the pipelines or happening? What are you optimistic about, if anything?
Well, it's yet to be seen. Quite frankly, if there were, let's say that in a large American city, the city sponsored 2 public gatherings. At one, Franklin Graham, Billy Graham's son, horrendous fundamentalist, would speak. And the next, you would be invited to speak, and you drew no less a size of an audience as Graham drew. Then I would feel optimistic. But you see, again, I can't feel optimistic if the general public doesn't give us a hearing. And they don't even let us explain why we shouldn't be despised. And they don't hear us. I mean, to me, I was the only person to raise the issue that Justice Thomas doesn't understand Christianity. What if you are saved, you're an evangelical and you're saved, and you lie in court about a business deal and get away with it, you don't lose your salvation. Jesus is not going to say to you on the judgment day, even though you accepted me as your savior, you go to hell. Because otherwise, the New Testament would have said that. Would have said there are certain violations of the civil law which will undo your salvation. And one is being untruthful in court. It didn't say that.
Yeah. So, yeah. So, I mean, it's not just about the message then, it's the mechanisms of the messaging.
Right.
And I think is a worry. And,
yes.
You know, you look at something like Fox News
Yes,
and how that's in bed with right-wing religiosity.
Right. And where it says, by faith alone are ye justified, let anyone boast, except if you cheat on your taxes. I mean, that it doesn't make these exceptions.
Right.
So what is the incentive? Actually, it was one of the founders of the religious right in 1980, Jerry Falwell, who, in supporting Reagan, again, he shouldn't have, the nonprofits are supposed to stay out of politics, but in his support for Reagan against Carter, lied about a meeting with Carter where Carter showed sympathy to gay rights. And he was confronted with that. And Falwell actually said, in order to promote Christianity and get people saved, it's okay to be untruthful about such things as long as you are not sexually unfaithful to your spouse.
He presented his own theodicy. It's
Yes.
like, you know, as long as there's a greater good that comes about, hey, I can just lie. It's not
exactly. That's what, and that's biblically warranted.
Well, yeah, I mean that's theologically. I mean, the theodicy is such an interesting idea. I've argued that it's consequentialist in nature, which means that the morality of such a thing is derived by the consequences that it obtains. And so, therefore, if any religious person who is advancing a theodicy is being consequentialist, and yet that's a moral system that does not require God in order for it to work as a moral value system, and so therefore is really like.
And one of the other things that I think we need to do with the public, this is going to be difficult, but we're going to have to show that the Bible, and of course the Quran, cannot be the basis for morality. It's, as Thomas Paine wrote in The Age of Reason, that any type of atrocity that would shock the mind of a child is unacceptable. I mean, look at the atrocities in the Bible. Now, William Lane Craig has said that God's wiping out whole races of people was justified because God created them.
Oh, but that annoys me.
Yeah, the atheist philosopher Keith Parsons has a response saying that if we create a race of sentient robots, we don't have a right to torture them just because we created them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would even change that from robots to just sentient creatures to get away from the idea. Like if we with a test tube created these sentient creatures that were basically, you know, humans or whatever, then yeah, you're absolutely right. Torturing them would still be morally bad. But I think things like, so I rail against stories like the global flood of Noah's flood. And the problem is that's a morally abhorrent story because God screws up his own design, he throws everything on the floor and says, right, I'm starting again. But in doing so, destroys all of humanity bar 8 people and countless animals and ecosystems. He literally just gets it all wrong, starts again, kills everything, starts again. And when you tell a child, when you teach a child that story, who's never had that story sort of embedded in their culture, as you're starting to get nowadays, where certainly in the UK, where you have a lot of religious apathy and people aren't born and brought up with these religious stories, then they start going, hang on, I've literally said this to children. And they've gone, hang on, that's not very nice, and start quite. But when you look at when I was born and brought up, those stories, you are literally 2-3 years old, and the stories of Noah's Ark you'll hit them with them and songs and cartoons of animals going on the Ark 2x2, hurrah, hurrah, and suddenly it becomes sort of acceptable, and you don't question the moral abhorrence of the story. But they are, as you say, really horrible stories.
And then another thing that, unless the general public understands this, we're going to have a hard time reversing the prejudice against us. And this is it. Lauding Abraham for being willing to kill his son Isaac just because it was God's command.
Such a horrible story.
I mean, the truth is, had Abraham in the story said to God, no, there's a point I won't cross. Not even you have a right to order such an atrocity.
But isn't it so? In that story, there's an odd part of the story that he argues with God about something else later on, something that's far less significant, right? God says, I want you to kill your son. And he goes, yeah, all right. And then he's just about to kill his son. And then God sends down an angel and is like, oh, don't worry, there's a ram over there. And he goes, oh, okay, brilliant. And then he's walking down a mountain and God's, something else goes on. And Abraham's like, hang on, I wouldn't do that. So he's arguing with God about this, morally insignificant thing, and yet doesn't appear to argue about God asking him to kill his own son.
Right. And also,
weird.
Once again, why didn't, when God was trying to make Abraham believe that he would have to kill his son, how about offering some comfort, saying, by the way, Abraham, I don't know if you know this or not, but I make people live after they die in a wonderful place. So don't worry. Isaac is going to a better world.
Yeah.
I mean, if there is life after death, why not bring it up?
Yeah. Yeah. But of course, it's not in the Old Testament at that point, which is
It's not in the Old Testament
bizarre.
at that point. So, I mean, this is and also the wiping out of whole tribes, and the subordination of women. The husband shall rule over the wife. Let not a woman speak in church, New Testament, because she's descended from Eve. And also Book of Deuteronomy, kill anyone, even your son or daughter, who beckons you to worship another god.
So, which is a really good point. So, to link back to what you said earlier, where you say, the religious people swear on a Bible. They, in a court of law, they make their oath on a Bible, and you're like, well, that Bible is just chock for it's actually that's arguably a morally problematic thing to do, because that Bible is full of really horrible moral scenarios, and yet you are now going to say, I promise I'm going to tell the truth because I believe in this really detestable scenario.
Yes, exactly. It makes, but we have to gain social acceptance to be able to say these things.
Yeah.
Which we don't have.
Virtue.
Yes. We have to be able to point out how primitive the Bible is.
Yeah.
And that this ancient morality is unacceptable as humanity has evolved. as we've evolved. We have to be able to do that. But my fear for the United States is that a Supreme Court that will allow the states to pass and then uphold religious oppressive laws will set us back.
Yeah.
Even as our demographic increases.
Yeah. And because the problem is, until you start, so how do you solve the issue of people not challenging the Bible in a way that you are advocating to say this? So how do we get to a point where a child says, yeah, that Bible story is horrible? And you get to that point if you critically evaluate the Bible from an objective point of view. But how do you allow that to happen in schools where the Bible in communities is held up as this paragon of virtue?
Well, what needs to happen is the schools need to be neutral ground for separation of church and state.
Absolutely.
The schools don't teach the Bible is true. They don't teach that it's false. So what we do is we have a cultural revolution where we're talking about this in public. But parents still can teach their children what they want, but the school has to be a blank slate. The public schools. In other words, the public schools do not indoctrinate one way or another.
Yeah.
And that's why the formal passage of Bible reading that was struck down in the early 60s was so important. And to essentially say essentially say that you must participate in prayer de facto in order to please your teacher, even though we're not saying it officially, that's religious coercion. I mean, this is so this is what we mean by government neutrality in matters of religion. No branch of government tips its hand one way or another with respect to theological matters.
Absolutely. And where we've had that cultural revolution, or we are in the middle of that cultural revolution now, by point of fact that, look, you and I are on YouTube talking live about the problem of religion, the problem of Christianity, or whatever, how the Bible is morally abhorrent in a way that never would have happened 50, 60 years ago. So that's happening in the wider culture. But it just doesn't seem to be reflected within education, possibly.
And well, it's not reflected as much. For instance, let's say that I were one of these televangelists in Texas with a church with 10,000 members, and you are a prominent British evangelical, and I'm interviewing you on the same type of program. Thousands more Americans would watch that than would watch us, even if they knew about it.
Yeah.
See, it's these automatic assumptions without reflection that belief in the supernatural and belief in a book of horror stories like the Bible is superior.
I wonder whether the free market will catch up. So once that demographic is established, that you'll start getting people realizing that actually it makes financial sense to advocate for these ideas, or to house these ideas. I mean, this is how, like, so I'm writing for this media platform called Only Sky, and this is a new startup that is aiming to be a representative flat platform for the non-religious, both in terms of a media organization, but also promoting things as far as politically speaking and going forward into the realms of church-state separation, etc., etc. Now, the people who just started up Only Sky had to go and get financial backing, right? Had to go and appeal to hedge fund managers and say, right, we would like you to fund this new enterprise. And they got that funding relatively easily because all they needed to do is present the data to suggest that this is where the demographics are going? Do you want to back a religious platform when the demographic is shrinking and going forward all projections are shrinking? No. Do you want to fund an organization that is representing a demographic that is definitely growing and will continue to grow? So it makes financial sense to do that. So I wonder whether in a decade or so, whether the free market might catch up to where the general public is, and whether it's all about the mechanisms of messaging. So where Fox News gets a lot of funding and it's a financial force behind right-wing religious politicization, whether actually the free market will catch up and provide a platform for the non-religious. I don't know.
I wish that were true, but the problem is, if the general culture is now promoting religion with the help of various governments unleashed by a religious right-wing Supreme Court, we would need non-religious parents to educate their children so that when they become adults and expand the demographic, the market would exist. So how do we now expand the demographic in a climate in which government is being unleashed to formally support religious belief?
Yeah.
Yeah,
And it comes back to that pushback, is like, as the religious right see the growing demographic, the projections, it's like, oh my goodness, we need to do something. So that's why they're so fervently kicked into action, because it's almost a defensive ploy. That's why I always liken them to an animal that's backed against that's more dangerous because it's in its death throes, backed into a corner, so it fights even harder. That's where I see the religious right at the moment.
Yeah, and also another point is, all living beings, whether they are four-legged or two-legged or eight-legged, when they are backed into a corner and their life is in danger, they fight with everything they have, including humans. If we all had a spark within us that knows about life after death, we wouldn't fight so hard.
I often think about the psychology of belief in life after death. I think it's a really great point, because there must be a huge amount of doubt in religious believers about the
Yeah,
afterlife.
it's now, okay, another thing is, in places like California, the New Age spiritual beliefs can be equally dogmatic, and they can that brand of spirituality can be fundamentalist. It's and this has been part of, in fact, 40 years ago, when we had a very conservative, straight-laced governor, George Deukmejian, the alternative newspapers would call him the Boy Scout in Lotus Land, and the joke is, how many Californians does it take to change a light bulb? 10, 1 to do it and 9 to share the experience. So this is, but you also see, I don't know if this happens in Great Britain, but still, the arrogance of those who claim they are spiritual but not religious. And it seems that whether it's conventional religion or New Age or mystical beliefs, there's the common thread that some connection to a supposed transcendental force of some kind makes you superior to those who don't seek or have such a connection.
Yeah. And I wonder whether, talking about the demographic growth of the nuns, not nuns and habits, but the religious nuns that have no religion, that can cloud the reality, which is a movement from religion, possibly as well, to spirituality and other forms of belief that isn't exactly sort of
Well,
secular
here
humanism or
is the
atheism.
greatest example of the special privileging of religion worldwide. No institution in the history of the world has had a greater child abuse scandal than the Catholic Church has come out over the past 20 years. And look how powerful they still are.
Yeah.
And look at in 2000, 5 years before becoming Pope Benedict, Ratzinger, when he was still head of the Office of the Doctrine of the Faith, which was actually the Office of the Inquisition, actually told bishops around the world not to turn child abusing priests into the local authorities, but handle it internally. What kind of arrogance is that to say we are the only child abusers in the world that don't have to answer to the laws of the nation in which we reside?
There's a really fantastic documentary, won an Oscar, or no, it's by an Oscar documentary filmmaker, Oscar-winning documentary filmmaker, Gibson. He did a documentary called Mare Maxima Culpa. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's about the deaf school in Massachusetts, maybe, but the deaf school that was a scene of a great amount of Catholic
I think
priest
that's
abuse.
Canada.
No, it wasn't. It
No, no,
definitely
no.
wasn't.
Okay.
Oh no, yeah,
Oh,
it definitely wasn't Canada. And this is the one that it's a supremely powerful documentary, because a lot of the people who are giving their evidence are deaf, and it's done through sign language
okay. Yeah.
with subtitles. But the emotion that they put through, like, because you're reading their faces rather than listening to their words, it's just a wonderful documentary, very, very moving, and deeply, horrible in many ways. But what came out of that was, as you say, Cardinal Ratzinger was in charge of the department in the Vatican at the time, before he became Pope. The sole responsibility was to get in the evidence of the files of these priests and then decide to move them from place to place,
Yes,
which is to
exactly.
say that he was legally responsible for covering up child
Exactly.
sex abuse.
Exactly. He absolutely
Hugely
was. And this is and I think it's just coming out now about a school or housing facility for young women in Ireland where there was so much abuse over decades. It was a Catholic institution of some sort.
That
I don't
wouldn't
know, it was
surprise me.
pregnant women. Uh, it just
That
something about
That has happened. I know that has come out in the past. I mean, there's a film called Philomena, which stars Steve Coogan, who's a real life true story. But yeah, there are certain really problematic
yeah,
in loads
it's
of different. Yeah,
right. And so what might have to happen is, given the benighted religious enabling of state-sponsored religion that the Supreme Court is allowing, uh, while we have to continue to struggle in the United States, other countries might have to also step up and try to produce more secularism within their borders. This we were doing very well until the Supreme Court fell to the religious right, until Justice Kavanaugh gave them the fifth vote majority. And we were still surprisingly all right until Trump managed to replace Justice Ginsburg with Justice Barrett.
that
There's an article,
shocker,
yeah,
absolute shocker.
I'm going to send you. There's an article about how Justice Barrett is part of some secret Christian society that's bent on taking. I don't know if it's. I mean, I examine conspiracy theories left or right with a
Mm.
critical eye, but
Yeah, no, I think
certainly,
I had read at the time that she was part of a very hardcore sort of Catholic
yeah.
group. I think, yeah, yeah,
So yes, and but you see, the thing is, the arguments for atheism are exceptionally powerful,
mm.
but there is a horrendous gap between the strength of our arguments and the public recognition of them. It's one of
Yeah. I
the
mean,
largest
you
intellectual
know this.
gaps.
You know this because you've debated a number of times against, as you've mentioned already, some really big figures: Peter Van Inwagen, Richard Swinburne, William Lane Craig. I was watching your Matt Slick debate the other day. All of these,
Yeah.
the first three were big names.
Yeah. I know.
But you know,
that was
yeah. So some really, and yet there you go, and you wouldn't say, for example, you have won that argument. And you've got predominantly Christian people in the audience, maybe, and you're thinking, this is water off a duck's back. I know this when I argue with my own father, right? And I completely destroy his arguments on X, Y, and Z. But it's water off a duck's back. It's not going to change his mind. And that's the depressing thing, that belief is predominantly psychological for an awful lot of people. But what's great is, of course, those debates end up being resources for other people who do have that seed of doubt and that are starting to question, and then go online and then look at, say, Eddie Tabash doing his thing, or my articles and books and things like that. Then these are the greater resources that people can dip into. But actually, at the coalface, in those debates, one of those reactions is to entrench in your position. When you're threatened with greater arguments against your position, it's called a backfire effect psychologically. You entrench in your position and end up, even further down that rabbit hole.
That's true, but it's a cycle that I remember when the former president of American Atheists, Dave Silverman, used to say that within 25 years we will normalize atheism in the United States, and I said it'll take 100 years. Because there has to be a seepage into the United States general culture that it's all right to challenge the claims of religion and to get people to look at those challenges.
I think you're getting there, though.
Well, we were, until the Supreme Court has allowed all these religion promoting. Now, of course, there are some things that won't be allowed, but still they're coming out of the mouths of elected public officials. State-wise, next door to me in Arizona, there is a Christian woman state senator who wants it to be mandatory for people to attend church, but a church of their choice. So this kind of thing, or Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia, who says that the California fires were started by
the
Jewish
old
business
Jewish
interests.
lasers. Yeah.
But okay, but recently she did us a favor because she has fractured her religious right coalition by talking about the devilish nature of the Catholic Church. So she's one of those old line Protestants that doesn't remember that arch-conservative Protestants and Catholics work together to create the theocracy, and they no longer bother each other with doctrinal differences.
I mean, when you bury down into your in-group, which her in-group for all intents and purposes is white, right-wing, religious, okay, but then if you're going to go further down there and like this religion versus that, this group, it's like the joke, the Emo Phillips joke, I think, about, are you Christian? Yeah, I'm Christian. Oh, I'm Christian too. Are you? Oh, no. And this goes on for 20 minutes. Like, are you Southern Baptist? Oh, I'm Southern Baptist too. And then it goes like, are you like XY Southern Baptist? No, I'm AB Southern Baptist. You complete bastard type thing. It's like, if you drill further and further down, and then
but the religious right doesn't
group.
drill further down because they're savvy politicians. For instance, evangelicals couldn't care less that no holder of the presidency has ever, on a personal level, lived more in contradiction with their ideals than Donald Trump, because they knew he would hand them the country through the courts. What do they care about his personal foibles? I mean, even if in their mind he winds up in hell, what do they care? He served the utilitarian purpose.
That's it. It's that theodicy. It's that consequentialist theodicy again. Greater good is, I don't mind biting the bullet on this because.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And so the
I just thought that's interesting. People who usually
yes,
assume I'm
okay.
Christian
Now,
because I'm
now,
nice.
what James is saying is most interesting, because the people who make that assumption forget that a Christian doesn't have to be nice because they're already saved.
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, we have to emphasize that. Also, we don't emphasize enough the grave contradiction between salvation by faith in the New Testament and the very contradiction of it within the book of James, where it talks about faith by
yeah.
salvation by works. I mean,
It's the classic tension.
you can't, you see, we have to use that to show the Bible is hopelessly contradictory. Uh, in Romans, you are justified, I think it's Romans, by faith alone. In James, faith without works is dead. You can't reconcile
Yeah,
those.
yeah.
And if the Bible is truly infallible and every book was divinely chosen, you can't diminish the book of James. I think like John Calvin wanted to.
Yeah, I would agree, and that's a huge one. I think what gets you into heaven, what gets you saved, works and deeds or faith is the insoluble, theological problem. This is a question, and thank you so much for your support, Doc. So Doc Pluromanaut says, and here's a question. We'll see if we can answer this. How much has historical misconceptions tying atheism to communism tarnished political trust issues? Is this something you've come across, Eddie?
I used to. Okay, this was a 20th century issue because of the Soviet Union. The way it plays out now is that people think that atheism, because it opposes the religious right and traditional religious-based values, atheists must be left-wing on every issue. That's not true. Now, a contravention of the historical coupling of atheism with communism is answered by, and this doesn't mean you have to agree or disagree with any position, but the foremost 20th century defender of unbridled capitalism, Ayn Rand, was a fervent atheist.
Yeah.
So
I love pointing that out to these
yes,
what I
and
call false libertarians who will
right,
hold up Ayn Rand and then at the same time say anti-abortion, which is liberty over your body, anti-immigration, and all these things. Like, hang on, she was a second generation. She was a Russian immigrant atheist who would it's the opposite to what these.
yes, yeah, right.
Yeah,
So what we have to point out is that, and this is why I want our organizations not to take on unrelated issues that people can disagree on, that atheism is political to the extent that it requires secular government. And in fact, in the early days of the religious right, I argued that our movement was making a big mistake by not involving principled conservatives who believe in limited government. I think the person who said it best was former New York Governor Mario Cuomo, when he said it's rank hypocrisy for the religious right to lecture us, the American people, about limited government, and then to turn around and try to use that government to tell us what God to believe in and how to apply the judgment of that God to our bodies and to our bedrooms.
yes.
Yeah,
So that's a really good. I didn't know he had said that
yeah,
because
he
I
yeah,
I often talk about the tension between the ideas. I think right and left wing are problematic ideas anyway because
yeah,
I
I do
don't.
too. Yes,
It's too simplistic. But the idea that the right wing believes generally in small governments, but will tell you what you can do in your bedroom and
right,
what you
right.
do to your
So
body. And a left wing is big government, but hey, when you're in your own four walls, you can do what you like with whoever
Right.
who you say you like.
And this is why a lot of people find libertarianism attractive, because it wants small government all the way around.
Yeah.
But one of the uh, problems with this is, even leaving aside abortion, when the religious right got started, one of the precedents they wanted to overrule was Griswold versus Connecticut. That was the case where the United States Supreme Court said, this was in 1965, and Connecticut, of all places, had a law that actually prevented heterosexuals married to each other from using contraception. Now, for any advocate of limited government to support the right of the state, in the words of Justice Douglas, to comb the sacred precincts of the marital bedroom in search of telltale signs of contraception, that's really, you can't reconcile that with, and also you can't reconcile uh, wanting to recriminalize same gender sexual activity among consenting adults. When we won in 03, Lawrence versus Texas, which struck down all the remaining laws in states which condemned same-sex activity among consenting adults, it was a case where police broke into the house of two gay men in Texas. So how do limited government right-wingers support that? I mean, it is, and I happen to agree with this, even though it may have had a right-wing origin. As you say, left-wing, right-wing is too simplistic. But the notion that your home is your castle, how is that upheld if the police power of the state can burst in on you searching for contraception or yanking you off to jail because you're two men caught in an intimate situation?
Yeah. Yeah, it's hugely problematic. I mean, to answer Doc's the second question, how do we decouple that faulty thinking? I suppose what Eddie's saying is that actually that has naturally decoupled somewhat in the last 20 years. But I guess as atheism becomes a more established position and worldview within America, for example, you will start, as we are seeing now, that actually there are a wide variety of atheists, many who are right-wing atheists, as well as your left-wing atheists, and
Right.
so
And
therefore it becomes more
well,
difficult to hold
this is
that
what
myth.
I have told people within our movement when I want us, for instance, not to become generalized left-wing organizations. The objective is, within 20 years or so, when someone stands up and says, I'm an atheist and I don't believe government can promote religion in any way, that we won't be able to tell from that where they stand on any other issue,
Yeah,
to universalize it.
yeah,
See, I don't mind if I disagree with a colleague in atheism on other issues, if we work together to promote secular government and to promote atheism.
yeah.
We need people from all walks of life,
Mm.
from all perspectives, to be welcomed in the atheist family. And now, the other thing, too, that the theists are teaching members of society to do is to dismiss us because we're based on a negative concept. That's a word play. Um, well, all you do is you don't believe in God. So what? Well, first of all, if the entire world believed in Santa Claus, those of us who didn't would be significant. So, first of all, there's nothing wrong with basing your belief on something that people believe which doesn't exist and sending out the warning cry that it's not real. There's nothing wrong with that. Uh, Secondly, you can twist it around saying we are promoting a positive worldview, which is the universe is natural, not supernatural, and we are equipping people with the intellectual tools to reject beliefs that aren't true.
And I guess that's the difference between atheism, which doesn't really tell you a lot, and secular humanism,
right.
which then
But
says, and that's where we go with it.
yes, but also secular humanism doesn't require a specific position on every political issue,
No,
but it
no.
does require that we recognize that government cannot promote religion. One of the worst examples of this, and we've made some headway, but not enough, are the laws in many states in the United States that allow people meant to be Christian Scientists to withhold medical care for their underage children. See, again, you can't say and be consistent with the constitutional separation of church and state, you have a right to kill your child by denying them medical care, but only if you have a religious reason for doing so. Once you're an adult, you have a right to refuse treatment, but you can't use your religion to kill your kids. This is why, for instance, 25 years ago, here in California, we got a couple convicted of second-degree murder because they refused to take their son who had eye cancer for medical treatment, and the boy died. So once again, only the religious can avoid complying with a law that should bind the rest of us. And it just like Jehovah's Witnesses, they demand exemption from blood transfusions. If you're an adult Jehovah's Witness and you choose to die in the hospital rather than having a blood transfusion, that's fine. But you can't impose that on your underage child. Just like you can't stab your underage child to death, you also can't deny them medical care that'll save their lives.
Just going back to what I mean, atheism and secular humanism versus theism. The thing I like about secular humanism, for example, is that you are building up your worldview, which includes your moral value system and your politics, from the bottom up. So you're like, we're starting with nothing, the naturalistic world, and I'll give you good reasons why I think that's the case, and then we're building everything up. Right, but it takes a lot of work and it is a lot of effort.
Yes, but the thing is on the way up from the foundation, as you start from the basement, the foundation, to the top floor, you're not assuming, you are not assuming unjustified speculative beliefs to base things on.
Exactly. So what I was going to say is that as you with secular humanism, we build up a worldview, but with theism, Christianity, you start with the Bible up here and you work backwards. And the problem is that it's not a building up, which therefore gives you this robust structure, which you can say, well, why do you believe this political? Why do you believe that this policy is good? Well, actually, it's based on this whole wall beneath it, whereas the theists goes, right, I'm starting with this book here and I'm just going to backfill it, and then it's all like a holy wall without any, I mean, I'm sorry to my viewers, I keep always mention this, but my book, Why I Am Atheist and Not a Theist, How to Do Knowledge, Meaning and Morality in a Godless World, the front cover is a wall which is all about building my entire worldview up and then saying, right, an atheism sits on this whole wall of like epistemology and etc., and we're building up a worldview rather than starting there and then backfilling it, and it's this really wobbly structure that isn't very solid at all.
We don't begin with the premise that certain things should be prohibited because the prohibition comes from on high. We examine what should or should not be prohibited empirically as we rise up from the foundation. That's very important.
And you argue this in your debates. Divine command theory. You take a pop at that often in your debates, and rightly so. Just as we move towards sort of wrapping this up, there's a few things I wanted to talk about. One is your debates. I mean, you've been involved in many debates, and my idea of being a debater of the subject of, say, God existing, you end up having to be a polymath, of being this expert on all these things. So as you've stood up in debate and you've talked about infinities and the Kalam cosmological argument and you know, the idea of a universe starting from nothing and having to have sort of mathematical knowledge and then a scientific knowledge, and then you're going on to talk about divine command theory, which is theology and philosophy, and then you're back over here to talk about, you know, evolution maybe, or the idea that the consciousness can't exist again without a material brain. You have to be an expert in all these different areas. How have you found that?
It's a constant learning process, but there is a unifying factor which makes it easier than one might think. And that's, again, to use your wonderful analogy of building up from the bottom. You start with a dispassionate search for evidence. Where does the evidence lead? Does the evidence lead that women are to be subordinate? There's no evidence for that. Does the evidence lead to that people who are in love with those of the same gender are intrinsically evil? There's no evidence for that. Does the evidence lead to a divine originator of existence? Well, after you go through the arguments, it doesn't. Does the evidence lead to a
Justification of slavery?
yeah, or to an all-powerful being that prefers some people over others? And does the evidence lead to a benevolent creator that tries to protect us from unnecessary suffering and evil? It doesn't. So you have to work into the arguments, but you always start with I mean, I remembered my debate with William Lane Craig in February of '99 when I kept hitting him on this one point. In his book, Reasonable Faith, the second edition, he said that we are enjoined to believe even if it's against the evidence. Well, in the third and fourth edition, that's not there anymore after our debate.
Really interesting,
Yeah.
because he relies a lot on the internal witness of the self-authenticating
Right.
witness of the
Also,
Holy Spirit.
before 9/11, one of his arguments was always that the willingness of the disciples to die for their beliefs was evidence that something supernatural happened with Jesus, and that your willingness to die for your belief is evidence of the truthfulness of the belief. He stopped using that after 9/11.
Right, interesting, interesting, yeah. So it's talking about your debates. What's your best experience in debates, or what do you think was the best that you did, or you know?
In my debate 3 years ago against the British Sunni Muslim Mohammed Hijab, who convenes a lot of impromptu debates in Hyde Park, from what I understand. My opening statement there was the most comprehensive. Also, I think in my debates with Doug Wilson, the presuppositionalist Calvinist, when I began by saying that if Christianity as he conceives of it is true, that Hitler would be in heaven if he decided for Jesus at the last moment, and my mother, the Auschwitz survivor, would be in hell. And also, in my debate with Matt Slick, when we were doing the fine-tuning argument, and he talked about how the universe is so delicately poised on the brink of falling over that there had to be a divine hand. And I said that if I create a computer program and I'm an omnipotent computer program creator, I would not make it so precarious that it hangs on a thread.
where it's just as easy to fall into a black hole as it is to live as well. But
Yes,
yeah, all
yes,
those physical constants are just
and then also
margin of error is tiny.
in my uh, 2017 debate against Christian apologist, originally from Sweden, Nick Kihas, when he was trying to use exorcisms and possession as proof of the supernatural. And I asked him, what are the boundaries of the possessing spirit? For instance, a possessing spirit possesses a child. Does that spirit's uh, width stay within the child, or does it extend, since it's a spiritual being and not confined by the physical, outside the child? So if you're within 10 feet of the child, you get possessed too.
That's a
In other words,
really interesting. I've never thought about that. Yeah, I like that. I'm gonna have to think. I might write a piece on that.
yeah, you see, that's uh, basically, again, what does the evidence show? It's like Theodore Drange, my debate coach, would ask, um, in the disembodied state, do we see all the way around our heads because we're not limited by eyes? How
Yeah.
does one soul distinguish from the other? What happens when we bump into each other? Do souls like amoebas merge? Or how are incorporeal souls keeping themselves separate?
I've just written a piece. It should be out on Monday, talking about IVF and souls and what happens. So with IVF, what happens is you get an egg and a sperm fertilized. You know, an egg becomes fertilized, and that happens in a petri dish. And then usually they fertilize a bunch of eggs, and so pro-lifers will say, well, these are now human beings. So in these petri dish, you've now ensouled because you've got a fertile. This is conception. But the issue, the interesting thing about IVF is what they'll do is they'll either discard a non-viable fertilized eggs or the weaker ones, which is interesting because it's IVF clinics will have more murder than abortion clinics, if that's what you believe,
Yeah.
or they freeze them. And they freeze them, so they'll freeze a whole load of eggs. So what happens to the souls then that are attached to these frozen fertilized eggs? Are they just hanging around in a soul bar somewhere, just chilling out? Are they in a warehouse of souls in heaven? And then you know, if for that petri dish that's thrown away, like what does that soul look like in heaven with Mother Teresa? Like, does Mother Teresa like walk around in heaven as her, and then like just a soul that represents a fertilized egg? She just bumps into that, or is this a talking rational being? Do you know what I mean? It's like there's so many questions that come out of the whole
And
idea of the soul.
also, let's say that we die now and we're in the afterlife. What language do we speak? Do we speak only English? What if you take a human being, the person is born, you keep them hydrated, fed, and climactically comfortable for 70 years? They never learn a language. They die. Do they pop out into the hereafter speaking a language all of a sudden? And
Yeah,
if
and
so, what language is it?
someone with dementia, do they are they in heaven suddenly? But are they with a
Right,
like?
but how do they, in other words, if a human being has never learned language, are they immediately given full knowledge of one of the earthly languages
Yeah,
when they die? And also, if out of the 60 septillion planets, what is heaven and hell universal? In other words, once we get to either place, will we meet beings from other planets, or is it like a localized institution where there's only where in the eternal heaven there'll only be earthlings?
this is
Or
such a it's such a good point. So I've written a feature article that was not going to be out for some time, but I've mostly written it to do with if you believe in aliens. I mean, aliens will exist out there. The universe is so big, we're just quarantined by space and time. But would would there be a necessity for atonement in every single world where there are sentient beings? So in other words, has there been like a billion Jesuses in these different
yes, right,
worlds?
right. It's as Thomas Paine asked, does Jesus have to continue endlessly incarnating and dying on every planet with intelligent beings to save its inhabitants.
Did Jefferson say that?
No, Thomas Paine.
Thomas Paine say that? Oh,
In
that's
the Age
brilliant.
of
I'm going to have to
Reason.
find that. I'm going to have to find that for my
Yeah,
article.
yeah. I mean,
I'll
how
write that down.
yeah. I mean, how many? And also, uh, another question is, Jesus ascended to heaven in the sky. How far did he have to ascend before heaven opened up to receive him? Or after 2,000 years, is he still floating through space, waiting to get to the portal?
He can fly the speed of light, obviously. He can go to
Yeah,
hyperspace.
yeah, yeah. And so, but whether it's Mohammed, Jesus ascending to heaven, Mohammed on the white horse, uh, uh, whatever it is. And you see, another thing also, again, Old Testament Hebrew school, Joshua and the sun standing still. You know, as Clarence Darrow pointed out to William Jennings Bryan in the Scopes evolution case in Tennessee in 1925, it was actually, it must have been the Earth standing still, not the sun. And if the Earth stopped rotating, everything would fly off.
Yeah. The problems are legion.
And
Yeah.
endless.
Yeah. So, and the other thing I just wanted to before we head off, the other thing I wanted to talk about is going back to your mother, the Auschwitz survivor, and there's a really interesting. Well, the story is supposedly the true story that the Jews in a concentration camp. I don't know which one, but they were like, why? Is bad thing happening to good people? Why were we the chosen ones, yet we're the ones in the concentration camp? And they supposedly put God on trial. BBC produced a great two-part dramatization of this called God on Trial. It's really worth watching. In fact, it's written by a Catholic who I think really had problems in writing that in questioning his own faith and stuff. So it is a really well written dramatization of God being put on trial, because where is God? So it's going back to the divine hiddenness and talking about your mother as someone who was Jewish and yet would have been thinking, I imagine, would she have been thinking, you know, where was God in all my trials and tribulations? What do you have to say to the divine hiddenness in the context of concentration camps?
Well, she had her own way of handling it. When I was young, though my dad, we belonged to the Orthodox synagogue, and for a while I went to the Orthodox Hebrew school, we weren't really that observant. And the rabbi came over and told my mother that if she kept a kosher home, he could come over and eat. She grabbed him and slammed him against the wall, and after a few expletives said, while you were sitting in your comfortable seminary, I was trying to survive in Auschwitz. I paid my debt for being Jewish like you never did. I don't have to serve you. You have to serve me.
Wow.
And then she whacked him across the face.
Wow. That's
So,
wrong. But those kind of traumas go one of two ways, don't they? They either make you question God, how could God, you know, allow this to happen, or it makes you embrace God as being the only way
well,
of understanding
this
that
is
particular.
how my mom didn't last too long. But my dad, when he would try to imply that I had to somehow preserve a Jewish religious context because I was the sole survivor of two families killed by the Nazis. And when he was in his late 80s, a few years before he died, I said to him that that's a reason why I can't support any concept of God, because my entire life, he never stopped being traumatized by the fact that when the Nazis invaded Lithuania after he was able to escape to Canada, they forced his mother and his two brothers and their families to dig their own graves and shot them into it. And so I said, Dad, the flip side is true. How can I worship a God who's all powerful and let that happen. And so this was about 6 months before he died at the age of 89. He looked at me, just patted me on the back. He called all of his rabbi friends and said, as my life comes to a close, I just want to tell you idiots, I finally became an agnostic. And says, and our God has a lot to answer for.
Wow.
You know, you know, you see, the thing is, just like when I was 16 years old, on my birthday, my dad runs up to me and said, my son, promise me you'll always be a good Jew, even though it's total bullshit. Okay, now that is not uncommon
Yeah, yeah,
in what happens among those of us raised Jewish is there's such an emphasis on study and learning that many of us then turn the laser beam of study and learning on the traditional religion itself.
yeah,
See, this is why a lot of fundamentalists want to disparage education.
yeah,
Yeah, you see, it is the traditional Jewish emphasis on education that sows the seeds of apostasy from
yeah.
traditional
And
Judaism.
this is why you see these silly signs, like, or these claims that, you know, from Christian fundamentalists: don't send your child to a university. Or it's the idea that somehow by learning more, by becoming wiser, you're more likely to throw off the shackles of religion. It's like, well, yeah, I mean, advocating for you know, ignorance, because that's more likely to result in you know, retaining your religion.
Yes, and or an earlier one of our viewers commenting on how his priest told him what
Yeah,
books not to read.
yeah. Don't read those Jewish books; they'll
Or don't
question.
read
You
any
know,
books. I mean, I remember at the same time in the in the early 60s, when the Catholic Decency League was controlling Hollywood. Uh, I mean, to the point where there were even Catholic leaders uh, in a subtle way trying to refer to the Babylon of Hollywood caused by greedy Jewish film producers who won't shy away from movies that are filthy just to make more money. And I remember even uh, someone saying to me in my late teens, you Jews control Hollywood. And I say, I wish that were true, but it's not, because if it were true, the movies would be much raunchier than they are now. And I could hardly wait for that. So uh, the concept of limiting intellectual exploration is what dogmatic religion needs to survive.
yeah.
Why do you think? I mean, look at fundamentalist Muslims like the Taliban trying to make sure girls don't get
I
educated.
mean, yeah, it's the key. So yeah, you're absolutely right. You know, education for everyone, particularly women, is the key to undoing the religious dominance that we have. You know, Afghanistan's chance of you know, clawing its way back up the global rankings in pretty much everything was universal education. As
Yeah,
soon as that doesn't happen, you're back down in trouble.
and also again the uh, let's talk about contemporary tyrants. Under Putin in Russia, it is illegal to fly the rainbow flag.
Yeah.
There is a law in Russia that punishes any kind of promotion of homosexuality as they define it. In fact, there was an article in the early days of the Ukrainian invasion where LGBTQ members of people in Ukraine were afraid of being specifically singled out for harsh punishment and abuse because of who they were.
You know, Putin's got into bed with the Orthodox Church in order
Yes.
to completely, you know, he's involved with the culture wars, promoting the culture wars narrative to, you know, to further his own political ends. I mean, it's a match made in hell. But you know,
Yes.
it's horrible. I was interesting because, you know, going to that kind of totalitarian ruler and that neck of the woods to some degree, and relating it back to your life, your mum being Hungarian, mum being Hungarian. I mean, what do you think of Viktor Orban at the moment?
We see, what frightens me is when he said that he's going to turn Hungary into a haven for traditional Christian values. And in fact, the American CPAC, Conservative Political Action Committee, just held their annual conference for the first time, not in the United States, but in Budapest. And I think that's again,
there's going to be money flowing. There's going to be money flowing into Hungary, dark money that you're not aware of. That is
right.
the reason why Viktor Orban's saying and doing what he's doing.
Yeah, but you see, here's what's interesting is, even if you want an unbridled economy, even if you want to assert certain control, everything needs to be argued without, as you said so aptly, starting from the top by saying this is a given, it can't be examined. That's why we have to, as you said, your wonderful analogy, build up from the ground up, because automatically God exists and automatically God told us what's prohibited. So we can't even examine it as we try to put together a society.
Yeah.
And this is really another thing too that I'm sort of happy about, that spirituality is incorrect, is reincarnation. It not necessarily the most pleasant world to keep coming back to. So, I mean, you know, one time may be sufficient.
Yeah. Especially, yeah. I mean, the whole nature is pretty problematic. I just wanted to. There was something that James said. I know it sounds like a pretty horrible statement, but it is so spot on. You were talking about earlier about omnipotence and what an all-loving God. If I could, this is a quote: "If I could stop a person from raping a child, I would," and that's the difference between me and your God.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Such a
Yes,
wonderful way.
and right, it's a wonderful way of doing it, and that also, in terms of monotheistic religions, all of them, makes us wonder why God didn't tell Muhammad not to marry Khadijah when she was 9 years old.
Yeah. Always.
Yeah, you see. Yeah, and this is there is no way that a culture, a legal system that favors religion will allow it to be favorable for atheistic, naturalistic arguments to be brought to society at large.
Yeah, and well, yes, it should be. I mean, really, even for a religious person, given religious plurality, the only answer for anyone is the only way forward would be secularization. You can only, you know, it's like John Rawls's veil of ignorance. The idea is, if you don't know who you're going to be born into being and where you're going to be born, what country, or whether you're going to be able-bodied or disabled, how would you set the moral rules up? You know, if I don't know who I'm going to be, how would I set the moral rules up? Well, it should be that favors everyone equally in some kind of fair and just manner.
Yes,
so
well,
therefore,
they basically, what's silly about the human species is we fabricate out of fantasy the gods that then frighten us to death.
Yeah. In order to fight,
yeah.
I mean, there are ways of keeping us morally in line, right? They just codify. There's nothing better than to say, you know, I say to you, Eddie, don't do that, and you say, I'm going to do it. So what? And then I then say, don't do that because God doesn't want you to do that, then I've codified that into like the most
Exactly.
powerful
Yes.
thing in conception. Job done. You know, it's perfect
Yes.
legal.
Right.
So just before we wrap up, if anyone wants to get any last minute questions in, now's your time. And thank you so much to Doc and Sobek for supporting the channel. That's really, really important to me and allows me to keep doing what I do. So thank you. So Eddie, what are you going to be concerning yourself with going forward? What does this next year look like for you, or the summer and autumn? What are you going to be concerning yourself with?
Well, for the issues we talked about today, the ongoing struggle to preserve as much government neutrality in matters of religion, even though right now it's a losing battle, and to continue to make sure that atheist arguments, the naturalistic arguments, get out there.
So how can people watching, I think this is a really important question actually, because
Yes.
what you're talking about is almost like the unsung dirty work that has to go on, that no
Right.
one sings the praises of. Like no one puts you up in the news and says you are doing an amazing you might see it in Free Inquiry, you might see it on, you know, AHA or wherever, in these secular organizations, but in reality people aren't singing your praises for doing what is absolutely essential work for the proper democratic functioning of the United States, right? So what is it that people watching here can do?
It depends where they are. If a viewer is in the United States, just make sure that in this year's Senate elections, that you support and vote for in your state the senator that will oppose religious right-wing judges and will confirm pro-church state separation judges, because it is the composition of the Senate that determines if Biden can appoint church state separationists to the Supreme Court. The other thing is, if you live in the United States, anytime there is a slight or a diminution of the non-believer, write a letter to the editor of your local newspaper. In fact, Jonathan, I'm going to just send you this. A few weeks ago, the Los Angeles Times did a huge front page article on how people of different religious faiths responded to the COVID virus. They actually published a letter of mine saying, in the interest of equality, you need to also cover how those of us without supernatural beliefs coped with and respond to a crisis.
Do you know what? I've read that because you sent it on that email. We're on an email group together,
Yeah,
Eddie
right.
and
Yeah.
myself, and I read that, and good on you. That's really well said. That was, yeah. So actually, so publicly challenging the diminution, as you say, of atheism as a belief.
Right.
I think
And
that's
if you are in the United States, the most important thing is that we must get church state separation judges on all levels of the federal courts. That's absolutely essential.
so. What's the
Then
process?
that means supporting Senate candidates who are in favor of church state separation. And
It's the importance of the Senate. Then it really
yeah,
is.
yeah,
The Senate is
right,
everything.
right, yeah. And now the larger question, which we can't get into, is whether there will be violence and civil unrest surrounding the 2024 presidential election, which could threaten the very civil order of the United States.
Yeah,
We almost saw that happen last year.
and it's taking a long time. With the DOJ is taking a long time to wrap that up, and the hope is that it's just because they're doing everything by the book and as properly as they can. The worry is that they are dragging their heels because they don't. It's going to be so divisive, or I don't know.
Right. It's yes, but that is and again, another thing is, in whatever country someone is, to welcome into atheist organizations non-believers of all kinds, of all persuasions, of all political views, because we need to increase our numbers and not alienate prospective members and co-workers because of differences on unrelated issues.
Absolutely. Thank you so much to James Apperton. Always a great great supporter of the channel. Really, really important. So thank you. And Eddie, you know, thanks for fighting the good fight. And I thank you as well. I mean, I'm not American, but with the sort of work that you do is honestly, it's so unsung. It's really, really important. Melody Joy, another great supporter. Thank you. Always hanging around and being a good value. So thank you for your super sticker. And Justus Rocha from South Africa. I mean, a massive supporter, previously supported hugely. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. That is really, really important. Again, as I keep saying, it allows me to keep doing this and allows me to justify to my family, who are back there now, running riot, no doubt, for 2.5 hours, going, where's our father? Where's my partner? I'm in here. This allows me to justify being in here and doing this, which I think is really important, because I think it's really important the work you do, Eddie, and the conversations we have like this to allow people to understand what you do, and you know, for the arguments like we talked about, like you said, getting these arguments out there, normalizing atheism, and giving people the ammunition to do the dirty work.
And thank you for the books you write that give all of us a platform to stand on.
Oh, thank you, Eddie. And you know, when I sent you an email saying, oh, by the way, you know, please, I'd be honored for you to come on and have a chat. And you said, oh, you'd be honored because you've got almost all my books and you really like them. So I was like, wait, this is like all my Christmases at once, or Hanukkahs or whatever. So no, thank you, Eddie. And I don't know if you know, but this is me spamming you. By the way, this is my latest book, and I absolutely love it. It's a real easy, quick read. But the reason I'm telling you this is because the arguments you came up with at the beginning of the show are basically these arguments. So this would be right up your alley.
Okay. I mean, my phrase to other atheists is, when you write a book, if we don't have it, get it.
yeah, exactly. That's the really great part. But just as thank you so much for that. Just the last few comments going on here. Thank you, James. We need you in a fight too, Jonathan. As long as my brain keeps going, like I've got multiple sclerosis, primary progressive multiple sclerosis, and my brain is only as good as my last week. And so, you know, I just hope that I can continue doing this for as long as I can, because this is so important and it floats my boat. Doc as well, thank you so much. Prosperity gospel for Eddie. Doc is a great supporter, but as ever, guys, do what Eddie says, which is get out there and support the politicians at all levels that are going to fight the fight for continued secularization, secularity of whatever country you're living in. It really important, because it's a slippery slope, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
And when you start going down, which I think America is going, I hope it's only a blip, but if it is a slippery slope and you can end up having a momentum being gathered, then that becomes a worry.
Yes, well, it's actually much worse than many people around the world realize. For instance, in the state of Georgia, they passed a law that if someone is waiting in line for a number of hours to vote, you can't even bring them food and water.
Yeah.
So we have a challenge, and thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you for having me on this.
Well, look, I hope it wouldn't be too presumptuous to say at some point in the future, Eddie, it would be Eddie. And I was wondering before this, because you're Eddie Tabash or Tabash, and you said your own name is Tabash. So I will try and remember it like that. But if you fancy another conversation, we can talk about whatever you want to talk about, but we can, you know, those worries that you were saying that we didn't get onto would be, you know, about the next election, and you know, do we have genuine worries of you know, violence or disruption in terms of, you know, the democratic mechanisms? That's a really big worry. And if you want to talk about anything to do with that, then I'm up for it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, look, everybody, go and find. Where can people find you, Eddie?
Do you
want people to find you?
Yes. Tabash.com.
Tabash.com.
Yep.
Or
That's right there. It
Tabash.com.
doesn't matter. Yeah. That's it.
Yeah, brilliant. We'll find him there and sing about his work and make sure that this stuff is in the public eye, because it's super important. Anyway, thank you, everyone. As I always say, make sure you question everything, but particularly yourselves. As ever, question everything, particularly yourselves. You're a great set of supporters. Thank you so much for all your support and for the lively conversation you've had at the side. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Eddie. Hopefully we'll do this again.
Okay. Thank you, John. Thank you.